It is Easter Tuesday, the 19th of April, 1814, and the pump room at Bath is crowded with silks and tall hats at 11 in the morning. The long windows stand open to the spring sun. The famous waters steam faintly in their glasses. At the west window, a little apart from the press, a tall man stands in a dark blue superfine tailcoat. His hair is jet black, wavy, cut close, with the first pale silvering at both temples. His eyes are steel grey, cool and sharp beneath thick dark lashes that tilt a little down at the outer corners, and they have for the last 11 minutes been fixed upon a young woman of 24, seated at a small round table some 30 feet away across the crowded floor. She is in plain black mourning, bombazine, high-necked, long-sleeved, with a white lawn fichu at the throat and a small jet cross upon a black silk cord. Her chestnut hair is smooth in a low chignon. Her skin is ivory pale. Her eyes, when at last she lifts them from her untouched glass of bath water, are a clear violet blue, very direct, and they cross the 30 feet of crowded room and find his at the window with an accuracy neither of them is prepared for. 1 second. Precisely 1 second. Then she turns her head, the smallest possible degree, and resumes her quiet conversation with the silver-haired widow at her elbow, and her gloved hand sets down the glass without the faintest tremor. He does not yet know that before Easter is out, he will ask this penniless, perfectly unknown gentlewoman to be his duchess, for the single purpose of ruining his brother's matrimonial scheme. He does not yet know that on the evening of their wedding, over a cold collation of chicken and ham and hothouse strawberries in a Mayfair supper parlour, she will set down her wine-glass and speak a single quiet sentence that will rearrange every column of his understanding of himself, of his father, and of the bargain he imagined he had made. He knows only this, that he has looked for 11 minutes at a silent woman in black across a room full of strangers, and she has looked back, once for 1 exact second, with the composure of a person who has been practicing composure for a great many years. There are marriages of love, and there are marriages of interest, and there are, rarer, more dangerous, marriages made in one afternoon for the sake of a quarrel with a brother. This is the story of one such marriage, and of the 12 hours after the vows that turned it from a punishment into a promise. The afternoon of Easter Monday, Marcus Rutherford, 8th Duke of Ashford, had ridden down out of Hertfordshire upon a hired post-horse. He had left his uncle's seat at Hatfield at 6 in the morning and had come along the Great West Road at a steady canter all through a blue Easter day, changing horses at each post and speaking to no one but the ostlers. He was 32, lean and 6'3" in his hessians. In the inner breast of his tailcoat, folded small, was a copy of his late father's codicil. He came into Bath by the London road at the pale violet end of the afternoon, with the great curve of the Royal Crescent already lamped at the upper windows, and the warm Bath stone mingled with the soft animal steam of the springs below the town, and nearer the smell of hot bread out of the kitchens on the Crescent. He gave up his horse at the mews behind, walked round to the front upon his own legs, and was admitted by Lady Pembroke's butler with the gentle unsurprise of a very old servant. His aunt was in the first-floor drawing-room with Reverend Hugh Harling of Oriel, who had dined at the Crescent every Easter for 21 years. Lady Adelaide Pembroke was 54, silver-grey, with a smooth coronet of hair and a small cream-lace widow's cap pinned to it, and a lavender-grey silk gown of half-mourning. Her pale, shrewd eyes had been obeyed for 35 years by nephews, butlers, and archbishops, in roughly that order. Reverend Harling was 65, white-haired, stooped, scholarly, in a plain black cassock, his silver spectacles catching the firelight. "Marcus," said Lady Pembroke, lifting her cheek without rising, "you have ridden hard. You will wash, and you will come down, and you will eat. They dined at 6 in the small dining room that looked over the garden, a clear soup, a turbot in lobster sauce, a saddle of lamb with new peas, and a Stilton. Mr. Pillman, the butler, poured 3 glasses of a light hock. The talk was of the Chancery calendar, a sermon Reverend Harling had preached on Easter morning at Bath Abbey, and the state of the London roads. Marcus ate with the appetite of a man 9 hours in the saddle, answered civilly, and volunteered nothing. His aunt, the best reader of faces in the family, knew he had ridden down with a subject he did not yet mean to lay upon the table. It was not laid upon the table until the cloth had been removed, and the port set down between them, and the Reverend had been invited by a lift of Lady Pembroke's shrewd eye to remain, because Lady Pembroke knew Reverend Harling to be a better priest than he was a gossip, and a better friend to Marcus than either. The candles were lit. The fire was made up. The butler had withdrawn. Marcus turned the stem of his glass a little in his fingers and said, in the dry, even baritone he used when the subject was serious, "Madam, I find I must speak to you of Julian." "I was expecting," said Lady Pembroke, "that you should speak to me of Julian." "You will recall," said Marcus, "that the codicil to my father's will gives Julian £60,000 on his 30th birthday, conditional upon his having first married, before that date, a woman of, the phrase is my father's, acknowledged respectability." "I recall the codicil," said Lady Pembroke. "I thought it ill-drawn at the time. I said so." "You said so," said Marcus, "and you were right. He has for 6 months been laying a siege to Miss Cordelia Marchmont, the Mayfair blonde, 20 years old, 5'6", pink and white silks, a practised smile, 25,000 in her own right, and the daughter, more importantly, of Lady Marchmont of Kelsey. If Julian succeeds, he will marry her before midsummer. And if Julian marries her, a daughter of the House of Kelsey, the family bride settling falls due. A further 100,000 of Rutherford money would, by our old custom, go to Julian upon the marriage, 100,000, aunt, which he will lay down at hazard within 2 years. He has said as much to me across a table at White's." Reverend Harling made a small sound in his throat. Lady Pembroke's expression did not alter. "And so?" she said. "And so," said Marcus, "I mean to marry first. I mean to marry within the month. A woman Julian cannot protest. A woman with no family to demand settlements. A respectable gentlewoman of no fortune and no connection. I mean to choose her in Bath in the next 3 days. When the news is in the Morning Post, Julian's siege of Miss Marchmont becomes absurd, and Miss Marchmont is not a woman who marries absurdity. Julian will keep his 60,000 if he chooses to marry anyone at all before 30. The 100,000 will not be paid, and Julian will learn, for the first time in his life, that he cannot write his own receipts upon his brother's hand. The fire spoke in the grate. Reverend Harling took a very small sip of port, and set it down with the careful neutrality of a man who has heard many plans in 40 years. "Marcus," said Lady Pembroke, at last, very quietly, "you will not buy a woman in the pump-room. I will not sit down to dinner with her. Aunt, I will not sit down to dinner with her. I love you better than any creature upon this earth, and I tell you at my own table that what you propose is beneath the name of Rutherford, and beneath, I think, the man I brought up from the time he was 12. If you do it, you will do it without my countenance." "I shall do it, madam. I ask your countenance because I should prefer to have it. I shall proceed without it if I must." Reverend Harling said mildly, "Adelaide, young men have ridden in from Hertfordshire upon worse errands. Let the boy sleep on it." And the subject was set down with the decanter, and at 10 the household went to bed. Easter Tuesday, the pump-room at 11. Lady Pembroke, in lavender grey and a cream lace cap, had walked down from the Crescent on her nephew's arm in a silence that was not forgiveness, but was at least the suspension of open war. She had an engagement to take a dish of tea with an old friend, Mrs. Sarah Fortescue of Somerset, a respectable widow of 62, silver-white hair, black bombazine, a white lace cap, whom she'd known since their girlhood at a Wells boarding school. The Duke escorted his aunt to the table near the west window, bowed, and withdrew 2 paces to wait with civil detachment. Mrs. Fortescue rose and made her curtsy, and presented her companion. "Your Grace, Lady Pembroke, I believe you have not met Miss Hartwell, who has lived with me these 2 years past." Miss Hartwell rose. She was slender, 5'4", very erect. She made her bow, not low, not slight, the precise degree her station required in the presence of a viscountess and a duke, and not a hair more. "Madam, Your Grace." Her voice was a soft, warm contralto, educated, composed. She sat again at Mrs. Fortescue's small nod, folded her gloved hands in her lap, and did not lift her eyes. Lady Pembroke took her tea. Mrs. Fortescue spoke of the Wells School, of the weather, of a mutual goddaughter now married in Shropshire. Miss Hartwell contributed 2 sentences in half an hour, each exactly judged, and the rest of the time sat silent with that composure which is not the composure of stupidity nor of fear, but of a person taught early not to speak unless something is wanted of her. And it was in the middle of that half hour that she lifted her violet blue eyes from her glass of Bath water, and found, at 30 feet, the steel grey eyes of the tall man at the window, and held the look for 1 exact second, and set down the glass, and turned her head the smallest degree, and resumed her conversation, and did not lift her eyes to him again. Marcus allowed his mouth the faintest dry inward flicker that would have served another man for a smile. Not stupid then, he thought. Not frightened. Not impressed. I shall have to be more careful than I meant. They walked home, along Milsom Street at 12:30, through a spring sun that laid the Pulteney sparkle upon the river at the bottom of the hill, the smell of hot bread on the air from a pastry cook's open door. At the door of the circulating library, with 2 volumes of Maria Edgeworth's Tales of Fashionable Life under her left arm and her plain black grosgrain reticule in her right hand, came Miss Hartwell, alone, upon an errand for Mrs. Fortescue. He lifted his hat. He did not speak. She returned the courtesy with a bow of exactly the correct depth, her violet blue eyes grave and level and, again, not lingering. Then she passed on, up Milsom Street toward Queen Square, and did not look back. Lady Pembroke, on his arm, said dryly, "She reads Miss Edgeworth for her employer. She walks alone at midday. She does not simper. I shall say no more at present." "I had not asked you to, madam?" "No, Marcus, but you had wished me to." 3 days passed. The Duke did not call in Queen Square. He did not write. He sat in the forenoons in his aunt's library, reading the Bath newspapers, walked down to Pulteney Bridge in the afternoons to watch the spring water go over the weir, and in the evenings dined at the Crescent. He also, by means of Mr. Pillman, a short civil note to an old Bath attorney, and a quiet half-hour with the incumbent of St. Michael's on the Hill, made such discreet inquiries as a man may make. Mrs. Fortescue was what she was, a clergyman's widow of competence, lodgings in Queen Square these 12 years, a pew in the Abbey, no debts, no scandal. Miss Hartwell had come to her 2 summers ago upon the recommendation of the widow of a Taunton rector. There was no family, there was no fortune, there was no whiff, not the faintest on of impropriety. At dinner on the Friday evening, over the removes, Lady Pembroke said, looking at the salt cellar and not at her nephew, "You are determined." "I am determined, madam. She is no fool. She is no fool." Reverend Harling, mildly from the far side of the table, set down his glass and remarked, with his small scholar's smile, "I have known worse opening gambits in a 40-year friendship." Lady Pembroke turned her shrewd, pale eye upon him. "Hugh, you are to be no help to me." "I am to be no help to you, Adelaide. I am to be a help, perhaps, to Marcus. It is a thing I have occasionally attempted for 23 years. Easter Saturday morning. The Duke of Ashford called by appointment in Queen Square at 10:30. He was shown by a small, neat maid into a small, neat parlour on the first floor. A fire, 2 sash windows upon the square, a carpet worn thin in 2 places, a mantel clock ticking, a print of Bath Abbey over the hearth, 4 chairs, a round table. Mrs. Fortescue rose to receive him with the gentle astonishment of a widow of 62 to whom a duke has not, in her previous life, been a Saturday morning caller. Miss Hartwell rose also, a pace behind her employer, in the same plain black bombazine, the small jet cross at her throat, her chestnut hair smooth in its low chignon, her gloved hands folded before her. She made her curtsy. She said, "Your Grace." Her violet blue eyes came up to his for one grave and unreadable instant, and dropped again to the pattern of the carpet at his polished black hessians. Mrs. Fortescue bade him be seated and offered tea. The Duke declined the tea. He said, "Madam, with your permission, I shall come directly to my business. I have imposed upon your mourning, and I do not mean to impose longer than I must." He waited. Mrs. Fortescue, with a small puzzled curve of her mouth, indicated that he might proceed. "Miss Hartwell," said the Duke, and turned very slightly in his chair so that he addressed her and not her employer. "I find myself in need of a wife, and I find myself in need of her within the month. I have considered the matter with care. I do not ask this upon a sudden fit of romance, and I shall not insult your intelligence, madam, by pretending that I do. I ask it for my own private reasons, which will not greatly concern you, and which have nothing in them to your discredit or to mine. I offer you, in return, the rank and dignity of the Duchess of Ashford. I offer a jointure of £5,000 a year, should you survive me, and a pin money of £2,000 a year during our joint lives, at your sole disposal and not accounted to me. I offer you, should you outlive me, a house of your own choosing upon any of my estates, and in any case, a private chamber of your own, at my country seat of Ashford Park in Oxfordshire, and at my house in Grosvenor Square. I do not offer you love, because I am not a man who speaks of love. I offer you the honest courtesy of a husband, and a closed door against any question of your past, so far as it is in my power to close that door. I give you 24 hours to consider. I shall ask for no answer this morning." The mantel clock ticked. Mrs. Fortescue had gone a little pale. She put her hand upon the arm of her chair and half rose and said, "Your Grace, this is so extraordinary a thing." "Madam," said Miss Hartwell quietly, and without raising her voice by the thickness of a hair, "I shall answer his Grace myself." Mrs. Fortescue sank back into her chair. There was a silence perhaps 3 seconds long. The Duke did not move. Miss Hartwell lifted her violet blue eyes and met his steadily and said, "Your Grace, I thank you for the compliment of your visit and for the frankness of your speech. I shall use the 24 hours you have offered me. I shall send my answer to Lady Pembroke's at the Crescent, by Mrs. Fortescue's maid upon tomorrow evening, if that is agreeable to you." "It is entirely agreeable, madam." "Then I shall not detain your Grace." He stood. He bowed, to Mrs. Fortescue first, with all the deference that widow of 62 was owed in her own parlour, and then to Miss Hartwell, with the grave exact courtesy one made to an equal. "Madam, madam, I am obliged to you both." And he was gone down the stair and into the Queen Square sun, and his ebony cane rang twice upon the pavement before the door had fully closed. Easter Sunday evening, the small back bedroom in Mrs. Fortescue's lodging in Queen Square, the candle lit upon the writing-desk at the window. Miss Hartwell sat upright in her straight-backed chair before a single sheet of good-laid paper. She had sat an hour at evening prayer in the Abbey at 5. She had walked home with Mrs. Fortescue upon her arm in the violet-blue dusk. She had said, at the door of the parlour, "Madam, I shall be upstairs an hour. I shall write my answer to His Grace this evening." Mrs. Fortescue had taken her 2 hands, kissed her once upon the forehead, and said, "My dear, I shall not advise you. You are 24, and you are more than I was at your age." The candle burned steady. The pen was mended, the inkwell full. Miss Hartwell sat for some minutes with her gloved hands folded in her lap, and thought of a great many things she would not write down. She thought of a house in Hanover Square that had been sold in the spring of 1803. She thought of her father, who had ceased to be a man of any consequence that April and ceased to be a man at all the November following. She thought of her mother, who had lived for 20 years upon her maiden name in Bath and had died the previous August in a small clean room above a silversmith's shop in Trim Street. She thought of £12 a year, which was what remained to her in the world. She thought of the tall man with the steel-grey eyes and the unvarnished speech and the closed door he had offered against any question of her past. She took off her gloves. She drew the sheet toward her. She wrote, in a clear, even hand, without a blot, "Your Grace, I accept the honour you have done me, on the conditions hereinafter stated, which I will give you upon your call tomorrow at 11. E. Hartwell." She read it once. She folded it exactly in 3. She dripped a small disc of plain red wax upon the fold from the candle. She had no seal of her own. She pressed the wax with the smooth back of her mother's thin silver thimble, which had been in her reticule since August. She wrote the direction upon the outside. His Grace the Duke of Ashford, at Lady Pembroke's, the Royal Crescent, by hand. She carried it down to Mrs. Fortescue in the parlour. Mrs. Fortescue looked at the plain sealed note in her hand, and at Miss Hartwell's composed face above it, and nodded once without speaking, and rang for her maid Polly, and the maid had cloak and bonnet on within 5 minutes, and was out of the door and walking up to the Crescent, through the soft, blue Easter dusk. At 8:30 precisely, Mr. Pillman came into the drawing-room on the Crescent with a small folded note upon a silver salver and presented it to His Grace. The Duke was standing at the fire with a glass of brandy. He had not yet drunk. Lady Pembroke, opposite, was reading and did not look up. Marcus set the glass upon the chimney-piece and took the note from the salver. He broke the plain red seal with his thumb. He read the 2 lines by firelight. He read them a second time. His steel-grey eyes went, very briefly, from the paper to the small clock upon the mantel and back to the paper. He folded the note again along its original folds and slipped it into the inner breast of his coat, beside his late father's codicil, and he turned his face a little from the firelight. He did not smile. Easter Monday morning came in over Bath upon a clean, pale sun, the abbey bells tolling 11 and a faint smell of river water and bread rising from the streets below Queen Square. The Duke of Ashford, in his dark blue superfine tailcoat, buff pantaloons, and polished black hessians, descended from his aunt's carriage a minute before the clock and crossed to Mrs. Fortescue's door. The maid Polly admitted him. He was shown into the first-floor parlour, the fire made up, the mantel clock ticking, upon the round table a single folded sheet of good-laid paper. Mrs. Fortescue rose and made her curtsy. Miss Hartwell rose a pace behind in the same plain black bombazine, the same high fichu, the same low smooth chignon, the small jet cross dark against the white lawn. She made her bow at the exact depth she had made it in the pump room. "Your Grace, I thank you for your punctuality." "Madam, I had no mind to be otherwise." Mrs. Fortescue, with a gentle glance at her companion, excused herself upon a pretext of household linen, and withdrew to the back room, leaving the door of communication a hand's breadth open. Miss Hartwell indicated the chair opposite her own. The Duke sat. She sat. She drew the folded sheet toward her. "Your Grace, I have written out my conditions upon a single sheet. There are 8. I shall read them, and then you shall read them, and you shall give me your answer. I have not written them to bargain, but because I do not wish that we should, a year hence, differ upon what either of us undertook this morning. Read, madam. She unfolded the paper, and the 8 clauses fell one by one into the small Queen Square parlour between them. The first, a private chamber of my own at Ashford Park, and another at the house in Grosvenor Square, reserved to my sole use at all hours. The second, the right to maintain my friendship with Mrs. Fortescue by correspondence and by a biannual visit, so long as she and I are both living. The third, a personal servant of my own choosing. I have already chosen her, Miss Sarah Coombs, 30 of Bath, 3 years in a respectable household in Laura Place, and willing to enter my service upon my marriage. The fourth, a private quarterly allowance of £200 into my own hand at my sole disposal. The fifth, that you will not come to my chamber in drink. The sixth, that you will not address me with impatience before the servants. The seventh, that I shall not be required to reconcile you to your half-brother, whom I do not know. The eighth, that you shall grant me, once in writing, the right to dissolve by mutual deed of separation any portion of this marriage beyond the legal tie itself, should either of us find the arrangement insupportable within 5 years. She refolded the paper, smoothed it flat, and laid it across the table to his hand. She set her hands in her lap. The Duke took up the paper, read it through once slowly, then a second time. The mantel clock ticked a dozen beats. He laid his own hand flat upon it. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "the first 7 are in my character, and I agree. The 8th I will sign. I have married under worse instruments, though I have not married any of them." Her violet blue eyes came up, very direct, very quiet. "Your Grace, may I ask what the worse instruments were?" He checked. The firelight showed the faintest colour along his olive-toned jaw. Then, with the clean, dry courtesy of a man who will not shelter behind an error, he said, "I have not married any of them, Miss Hartwell." That was not well put. I have never married. I apologise. I meant only that I have signed worse contracts in my life, and I am happy to sign this one. She inclined her head. "I thank your Grace for the correction. I shall remember it. Madame, you will oblige me by remembering also the first sentence." "I shall remember all of it, your Grace." He took a silver pencil from his inner pocket and wrote at the foot of the sheet, "I consent to the 8 clauses above. They shall be embodied by Mr. Stokes in the settlements drawn upon our marriage. Ashford." He stood. He bowed. "Madam, Mr. Stokes, of Stokes and Tremaine, Lincoln's Inn, shall wait upon Mrs. Fortescue within the week." He was gone down the stair, the cane ringing twice upon the pavement before the front door had closed. Mr. Stokes was 57, tall, thin, a little stooped, with thin greying hair and a long, narrow scholar's face, clean-shaven above a plain white cravat. He wore a plain black superfine tailcoat, black silk waistcoat, black pantaloons, small gold-rimmed spectacles at his breast pocket, beneath his left arm a leather portfolio. He received the Duke at Lincoln's Inn upon the Wednesday, and set himself down over 5 days to the drafting, a jointure of 5,000 a year, pin money of 2,000, the quarterly £200 into the Duchess's own hand at each quarter day, and upon its own sheet clause the 8th, drawn with the narrow exactness he would have drawn a clause between sovereign houses. On the Thursday, his clerk went to Doctors' Commons and purchased from the Faculty Office of the Archbishop of Canterbury a special licence upon the £10 stamp, Mr. Stokes filed the document and closed his portfolio. On Monday the 18th of April, at 7 in the morning, a hired post-chaise drew up at the north side of Queen Square in a grey Bath rain. Mrs. Fortescue in black bombazine and travelling shawl, Miss Hartwell in her plain mourning and a black chip-straw bonnet, the maid Polly, 2 small trunks strapped behind. They set off at 7:15, changed horses at Chippenham, dined at Marlborough, and came in through Hyde Park toll gate at 9:30 on the Tuesday. They put up, at the Duke's expense, at a quiet private hotel in Albemarle Street. Evangeline was fitted through the week at the London sister establishment of her Milsom Street mantua maker in South Molton Street. Mrs. Fortescue attended every fitting. The mantua maker was given, with perfect gentleness, the tactful fiction that her customer was a Bath widow of small competence, remarrying very quietly at her gentleman's wish, and she, who had heard many such stories and kept them all, did not raise her eyes from her pinning. Lord Julian Rutherford was, that week, at Newmarket, where he lost 400 guineas upon a bay filly, and did not return to Albany until the evening of Saturday the 23rd. Of his brother's marriage he knew, until that Saturday's Morning Post was laid before him with his chocolate, precisely nothing. Friday the 22nd of April, 1814, came in clear over London with a blue spring sky above the chimneys of Mayfair. At 10:30, the bride was dressed in the upstairs room of the Albemarle Street Hotel. The dove-grey silk, close-fitted, short-sleeved, fell in quiet folds to her slippers. The white lawn fichu lay crossed at her throat. Mrs. Fortescue herself pinned the small coronet of white narcissus and ivy upon her smooth chestnut chignon. The plain white kid gloves drew up to her elbow. Her mother's single strand of seed pearls lay warm against the ivory skin at her throat. The plain gold band waited upon Mr. Stokes's open palm in the vestry. The looking-glass showed her, for one long second, a woman she had not been in 12 years. She drew a steady breath and said, very low, "Madam, I am ready." The carriages drew up in Hanover Square at 2 minutes before 11. The pale Portland stone portico of St. George's rose above the pavement, 6 great Corinthian pillars, worn stone steps, a small knot of parish curious at the railings, a flower seller, 2 nursery maids, an elderly gentleman with a stick, made a respectful lane as the dove-grey silk passed between them. Inside, the church was cool and still. The pale stone aisle ran the length of the nave between long rows of high oak box pews. A low spring sun laid a lozenge of red and blue upon the flagstones from the stained-glass east window. The Last Supper, the colours bright above the altar. Tall brass candlesticks burned at either side of the communion rail. Reverend Hugh Harling, in white surplice and stole over his black cassock, his silver spectacles catching the window light, stood before the altar with his Book of Common Prayer open. The congregation was small. Lady Adelaide Pembroke sat in the front pew upon the north side, in her lavender-grey silk, half-mourning cream-lace widow's cap, pearls, amethyst cross upon a black silk cord. Mr. Stokes sat behind her in his plain black portfolio upon the seat. Mrs. Fortescue, in black bombazine, had her lace handkerchief already balled in her gloved hand. Mr. Pillman, the Ashford butler, stood at the end of the pew with the discreet attentiveness of 35 years' service. Behind them, 3 or 4 parish faces, a verger's wife, a cook from the corner, a clerk who had slipped in because he had seen the flowers, sat very still in the quiet of the nave. The Duke came up the aisle alone, his black hessians ringing softly upon the pale stone. He wore the charcoal-grey superfine tailcoat, the high white starched cravat, the white silk waistcoat with its faint silver pinstripe, white pantaloons, the polished black hessians. Upon his right hand, the Ashford ducal signet, heavy gold, The raven upon the chain sword caught the candlelight. At his lapel, a single sprig of white narcissus. His steel-grey eyes were steady. He took his place at the communion rail and did not look back. Mrs. Fortescue brought the bride up the aisle upon her arm. At the rail she placed Evangeline's gloved hand in the Duke's, pressed the fingers once, and stepped a pace back. The Duke inclined his head to his bride. She inclined hers to him. They turned together to face Reverend Harling. The old priest read the simple form from the Book of Common Prayer in his gentle scholar's voice, each word placed clean upon the air of the nave. At the question he put to the bride, Evangeline said quietly, "I will." At the question he put to the groom, the Duke said in his measured, deep baritone, "I will, and with my whole estate." The plain gold band went upon her gloved finger. Reverend Harling spoke the words that joined them. Lady Pembroke's gloved knuckles pressed once, hard, against her lips behind her fan. Mrs. Fortescue wept silently into her handkerchief, as she had promised herself she should not. In the vestry the bride drew off her right glove, took up the pen, and wrote in the clear, even hand Mr. Stokes had already seen upon a single sheet of laid paper in Bath. Evangeline Hartwell. She blotted the signature. The Duke wrote beneath hers, Ashford, the signet catching the vestry candle. Reverend Harling, Lady Pembroke, and Mr. Stokes witnessed in turn. The register was closed. The marriage was, in the cold, quiet language of the law of England, good. The notice would run in the next morning's Morning Post and in the Times at the head of the marriages column. On Friday, the 22nd instant, at St. George's, Hanover Square, by special licence, by the Reverend Hugh Harling of Oriel College, Oxford, His Grace the Duke of Ashford, to Miss Evangeline Hartwell, late of Bath. The wedding breakfast at Ashford House, Grosvenor Square, was laid for 15 in the great dining room. The long mahogany table, lemon-polished, set with the Ashford silver and white hothouse lilies in 3 low bowls. Mrs. Fortescue, at Lady Pembroke's particular direction, was seated at Lady Pembroke's left. Mr. Stokes, at the foot of the table, rose once, lifted a glass of hock, and gave a single grave toast. To his Grace, the Duke of Ashford, and to her Grace, the Duchess of Ashford, long life to them both, and the ordinary civilities of every day between them. The table drank standing. Evangeline answered by inclining her head to Mr. Stokes and speaking in her soft, warm contralto 3 civil sentences of thanks that were heard at every chair. She did not blush. She did not hesitate. She spoke. Lady Pembroke afterwards privately remarked to Mr. Stokes, as their carriages were called, with the carriage of a woman who was taught to command a drawing-room before she was 16. Mr. Stokes, in his carriage home to Lincoln's Inn, took out his small leather pocket-book and wrote upon a clean page, Poolbath Parish Registers. Any Hartwell family since 1788. Private. He closed the pocket-book and said nothing of it. The guests departed between 3 and 4. Mrs. Fortescue kissed the new Duchess upon both cheeks, said, "My dear, I shall write upon Monday," and was handed into her carriage. Mr. Pillman closed the great front door with the quietness of a butler who has understood the hour. Lady Pembroke did not go at 3. She stayed with her new niece in the small green saloon upon the ground floor, pale apple-green silk walls, a cream Aubusson carpet, 2 long windows upon the garden, a fire banked low. They sat an hour with a fresh pot of tea. They did not speak of the marriage. They spoke of Mrs. Fortescue, of Bath, of Lady Pembroke's own girlhood at the Wells School. Lady Pembroke, who had sat down in the carriage from Hanover Square in guarded reserve, rose at 5 in guarded approbation. At the door of the green saloon, she turned back, took Evangeline's hands in her own, drew her forward, and kissed her once upon each cheek, the Rutherford kiss of welcome which she had last bestowed upon a niece by marriage 19 years before. "My dear," she said almost crossly, "I shall give a dinner for you within a fortnight. You will not shrink from me. I have survived 2 sisters-in-law I did not expect to like, and I find I have no reasonable excuse not to like you." Evangeline answered, very low, "Madame, you shall not find one. I shall not give you one. That, my dear, is what I feared. Good afternoon." And she went down the hall to her carriage, and Mr. Pillman closed the door behind her. The house settled. The spring dusk came on over Mayfair. The lamps were lit in Grosvenor Square below. Mr. Pillman gave the orders for a quiet supper, 2 covers in the west parlour, a cold collation, the servants to withdraw once the table was laid. The supper parlour was a small square room of pale straw-coloured silk walls and a cream plaster cornice with 2 long windows over the square, now curtained in heavy fawn damask against the April dusk. A fire burned low in the white marble grate. In the middle of the carpet stood a small oval mahogany table, lemon-polished that afternoon, laid for 2. At its centre the 3-branched silver candelabrum held wax candles newly lit, the flames quiet and tall in the still air. The cold collation had been set out with the particular fastidiousness servants reserve for a wedding night: cold spiced chicken upon watercress, a York ham in aspic, cut in neat slices, a tall-footed dish of hothouse strawberries out of Kent, a cut-glass decanter of claret, a plain jug of lemonade. The servants, their work done, had withdrawn upon Pillman's nod and closed the door behind them. The new Duchess came in first. She had added only a fine cashmere shawl of pale lavender over the dove-grey silk. The seed pearl still lay at her throat. She took the chair at the far side of the table, her face toward the fire. The Duke came in a minute after her, unchanged, the charcoal-grey tailcoat. The white cravat loosened a finger's breadth, the white silk waistcoat, the Ashford signet. He poured her half a glass of claret and half of lemonade, a glass of claret for himself, and sat. They spoke, at first, of the church and the flowers, the handsome east window, the narcissus holding its freshness, Reverend Harling's clean simplicity. Evangeline remarked quietly upon the kindness of Mr. Stokes's toast. The Duke remarked, as quietly, that Mr. Stokes had never in 30 years made a toast that was not, at bottom, an instrument. A small silence fell between them, as easy as a silence between 2 people of good breeding can be, upon the evening of a day neither will entirely remember by sleep. Evangeline took up her glass, drank 1 careful small sip of claret, and set the glass down upon the polished mahogany with a small dry click that was the only sound beyond the ticking of the silver clock. She folded her gloved hands in her lap. She lifted her clear violet-blue eyes to his across the 3 candle flames. "Your Grace, before we retire for the night, you are owed the truth of the woman you have married. My name upon the registry this morning was not Evangeline Hartwell, though it was entered lawfully. Hartwell was my mother's maiden name, and I took it as a companion so that my employers should not know me as an earl's daughter. I am Lady Evangeline Ashworth, the only legitimate child of Henry Ashworth, late Earl of Hargreave, who was ruined at cards in the October of 1802 at a private house on Bolton Street by a party of gentlemen that included, as I believe, your father, Charles Rutherford, the 7th Duke of Ashford. My father shot no one and fought no duel. He merely settled his debts over the following winter by the private sale of every acre and every painting and every book of Ashworth House, and in the April of 1803 he ceased to be a man of any consequence, and in the November of the same year he ceased to be a man at all. My mother took me into lodgings in Bath and lived upon her maiden name for 20 years. I took her name upon her death last August because I did not wish to marry for the Ashworth pity, nor for the Ashworth ruin, nor for any man's idea of what a dispossessed earl's daughter is owed. You have married me, your grace, for reasons of private spite. I have married you for reasons of my own, which I will tell you honestly now, if you wish to hear them. We have both, I believe, made a true bargain. The clock ticked. The fire spoke once in the grate. The Duke did not move. He did not lift his glass. For a full minute, the silver clock counted 60 plain ticks between them. He sat quite still, looking steadily at the face of the woman opposite him across the candlelight. And her face looked steadily back, without apology and without pride. At last he said, in a voice very quiet and very even, "And what are your reasons, Lady Evangeline?" She answered without haste, as one answers a question one has long since composed the answer to. "I am 24 and have £12 a year. I wish for safety, a roof, a country house where I may walk without making myself small, the dignity of a name that cannot be taken from me, and the ordinary civilities of a husband who does not come to me and drink. In return I shall be a good Duchess of Ashford. I was raised to it before I was 15. I have not forgotten the skills. I do not ask for love. I do not ask for your heart. I ask only that we live in honest respect of one another." She folded her hands again. She did not lower her eyes. The candles burned. The silver clock upon the chimney-piece, very quietly, struck the half-hour, 9 small clear strokes of a high silver bell in the still room. The Duke set down his untouched glass. He stood, very slowly, as a man stands in a cathedral, drew himself to his full 6'3", and bowed to his wife for the first time as her husband. A bow not of form, not of civility, but the slow, deep bow a gentleman makes to an equal whose quality he has, at last, understood. "Lady Evangeline," he said, "I shall try to earn more than you have asked." The candelabrum burned low, the strawberries lay untouched, the silver clock ticked on. He bowed once more. He said nothing further. She rose. She made her curtsy, the grave exact curtsy of a drawing-room at Ashworth House 12 years gone, took up her silver candlestick from the side-table, walked out into the lamplit hall, crossed the polished boards to the foot of the grand staircase, set her gloved hand upon the mahogany banister, and began to climb. At the turn of the landing, she paused and looked back over her pale lavender shawl. He was still standing at the foot of the stair, his hand resting upon the carved newel, his steel-grey eyes lifted to her. He bowed a third time, slowly. She inclined her head. She turned. The dove-grey silk passed out of the candlelight into the upper gloom, and the door of the east wing chamber closed, very quietly, behind her. Below, in the supper parlour, the wax candles burned lower upon the oval table, and the silver clock ticked on in the Mayfair dusk, and the Duke of Ashford stood some time at the foot of his own staircase before he moved. The house in Grosvenor Square was not sleeping when the Duke and Duchess of Ashford came down its stairs the next morning. The servants had been up since 5. The kitchen had packed the travelling basket. The grooms had seen the 4 bay horses harnessed to the private travelling carriage. The April sun was low upon the Portland stone of the square as the Duke handed his wife up into the dim leather quiet of the coach. They had breakfasted together at 7 in the small front parlour. A plain white cloth, 2 cups of coffee, thin bread and butter, a boiled egg each. They were civil. He asked whether her cases had been properly strapped. She answered that Sarah Coombs had seen to it. He asked whether she had slept. She said she had slept adequately, and begged to know the same of him. He said he had slept enough. Neither alluded to the supper parlour of the night before, nor to the name she had set down upon the registry, nor to the minute in which a silver clock had ticked through 60 plain strokes between them. the speaking was done. They left Mayfair a little before 8. The Duke rode the first stage upon his own black hunter. Evangeline sat within with her maid. Her mother's small mahogany writing desk, braced upon the seat opposite, 3 books stacked upon it, and the sealed letter of blessing Mrs. Fortescue had pressed into her hand. She did not open the books. She looked out at London running backwards through the window, and then at the first miles of the road to Oxford in the soft April light. They pressed on through Uxbridge and High Wycombe and Marlow, and by 7 in the evening drew up in the paved yard of the Red Lion at Henley. 3 rooms had been bespoken, a private parlour, a bedchamber for her Grace, and a second for his Grace at the farther end of the same corridor. They took a plain supper of roast mutton, early peas, and baked apples, with a single glass of a tolerable claret, and spoke civilly of the road. They parted at the foot of the narrow inn staircase, a little before 10. He bowed. She curtsied. He did not go to her chamber. He did not propose to go. Each door closed upon its own lamp. They breakfasted again at 7 on the Wednesday morning. They were civil. They set out at 8. The carriage went on through Nettlebed and Wallingford, and Dorchester upon Thames, the oak scrub of the Chilterns giving way to the wide Oxfordshire fields in their first bright green, and by 3 in the afternoon they turned in at the great iron gates of the park. The gatekeeper's wife came out of the lodge and curtsied low. The 4 bays were set at a steady trot up the long drive, and the Duchess of Ashford saw, for the first time, the country she was to be mistress of. The drive ran 1.5 miles through open park between ancient oaks, oaks that had stood 3 reigns and more, the short-cropped turf of the sheep-walk running green between them, the shadows of their half-leafed crowns falling long and dappled upon the road. A little fallow deer lifted her head at 1/4 mile and watched the carriage pass. The lime avenue began a little further on, a perfectly ruled aisle of young lime trees freshly in leaf, running straight at the front of the house. And then the house showed itself. It was a Palladian front of honey-coloured Cotswold stone, high and clean and square under the May sky, with a great columned portico of 6 fluent columns, a long low sweep of wings upon either hand, a stone stable-yard rising to the east with its cupola, a walled rose garden showing at the south in the first soft buds of pink and ivory, and, beyond the lawn, an ornamental lake of grey-blue water, upon whose farther shore moved a single white swan. The Cotswold sun struck the portico, and the honeystone walls gave back a warm, steady gold. Evangeline set her gloved hand for a moment upon the leather strap at the window, breathed once, and let the breath go. They drew up upon the gravel before the portico. The whole household stood ranged upon the broad stone steps, the butler at the head, the housekeeper a little below him, the steward to one side, and behind them in 2 neat lines, 20-odd servants in clean aprons and black coats. The Duke handed his wife down. She went up the steps at her husband's side, with her head a little lifted and her hand light upon his arm. The butler came forward and bowed. Mr. Hemsley was 55, of medium height, with silver hair combed straight back, a long, clean-shaven face, and the quiet dignity of 25 years of butlering. He wore a black, superfine coat, a plain white cravat, a black silk waistcoat, black pantaloons, and polished black shoes with steel buckles. "Your Grace, Madam," he said, "the household of Ashford Park welcomes her Grace home." He bowed a second time. The Duchess returned the bow with a small exact inclination of her chestnut head. "Mr. Hemsley, I thank you, and I thank the household." Mrs. Hannah Gibbons was 59, stout and brisk and 5'4", with iron-grey hair pinned in a low bun beneath a starched white linen cap, warm pale blue eyes and a kind round face. She wore black bombazine with a white linen apron and a large silver chatelaine at her waist. She curtsied. "Your Grace, if it please you, ma'am, I shall present the household." Evangeline said, "Mrs. Gibbons, it would please me." Mr. Calder the steward bowed from his place. He was 50, 5'10", broad and country-weathered, with short sandy brown hair receding at the temples, a close-cropped sandy beard, steady hazel eyes, and a square, honest face. He wore a dark brown wool country coat, a buff waistcoat, brown cord breeches, brown leather gaiters, and stout country boots polished clean of their field dust. Mrs. Gibbons then took the Duchess along the line. Evangeline went with her, without haste, and gave each of the servants her hand. The under-butler, the footman, the Duke's valet, the groom of the chambers, the still-room maid, the housemaids, the laundry-maid, the dairy-maid, the cook, Mrs. Parkin, the kitchen-maid, the gardener and his men, the head-groom, the stable-boy. Mrs. Gibbons named each one. Evangeline repeated the name as she took the hand, and to each she said a quiet, particular word, that she had heard of Mrs. Parkin's pigeon pie, that the roses showed very well in bud, that Jenkins had kept the lime avenue in good order. She did not hurry. She did not skip a face. The Swan moved without haste upon the distant lake, and Mr. Hemsley watched, without quite appearing to watch. That evening, in the steward's room upon the ground floor of the east wing, Mrs. Gibbons poured Mr. Calder a small glass of her own cowslip wine, sat down in the Windsor chair beside the fire, and folded her apron under her two hands. "Mr. Calder, we have the thing. We have a real Duchess now. She did not miss one of them." Mr. Calder lifted his glass a short, quiet inch, inclined his sandy head, and said only, "Aye, Mrs. Gibbons, I believe we have." Supper that first night was laid in the small green dining-room at the southeast corner of the ground floor, for the great dining-room of Ashford Park was reserved for company. The small room was walled in pale green silk, with fine white pilasters and a pair of narrow windows opening upon the lawn, and held a round mahogany table for 3 tall candles in silver, and a bracket clock that ticked with small, tidy precision. They dined at 7:30 upon a consommé, lamb cutlets with young peas, a spring salad, and a custard tart. 2 footmen served. Mr. Hemsley stood behind his Grace's chair. They were civil. The Duke spoke of the estate, of the new drainage scheme for the lower meadows, of the age of the oaks, some 200 years, of the lime avenue planted by the 5th Duke upon his marriage, of the village of Ashford Ruthven with its small Norman church. Evangeline spoke of Bath, of the walks upon the hill above the circus, of the quiet mornings in the pump-room, of Mrs. Fortescue's circulating library habits, of the service at St. Michael's on the hill. They did not speak of London, nor of Easter, nor of the supper-parlour of the night before. At 10, they rose. The Duke gave her his arm as far as the foot of the grand staircase, and there he released it. He bowed. She curtsied. She took her silver candlestick from the side table and climbed the wide oaken stair, the banisters soft and warm under her palm with a century of beeswax. To the east wing and the blue bedchamber, where the walls were hung in pale blue silk, the pilasters ivory, and a small mahogany writing desk stood under the window that looked southward over the lawn to the lake. His door, 50 yards away in the west wing, closed at much the same hour. The corridor between them was walked by no one. The 10 days that followed took the quiet shape of a household receiving its mistress. Mrs. Gibbons, chatelaine at her waist, showed Evangeline the still room and the linen presses and the china closet, the scented airing press where fresh linen lay in blue paper between dried lavender stalks, and the dairy with its pans of cream cooling upon slate. Evangeline was quick. She had been raised to know the inside of a great house and had learned in Bath to keep accounts upon £12 a year. Between the two trainings she made Mrs. Gibbons, within a week, easier upon half a dozen small standing questions. Mr. Hemsley observed that Her Grace addressed the underservants by name upon the second day and had not repeated a mistake. Mr. Calder walked her through the homewood one morning when the May sun came down in long green shafts between the tall oaks and the high grey boles of the beeches. The bluebells were at the last of their flowering, a pale blue haze low under the trees. The wood pigeons were at their steady, soft calling. Calder spoke of the timber, of which trees were for thinning and which for keeping another century. They paused at a stile. Calder, with his hat in his hand, said with a kindly Cotswold clumsiness, "I hope your Grace will forgive an old steward for plain speaking. The late Duke Charles was a hot-tempered gentleman, ma'am, and his boys have had their differences with his memory, but the present Duke has mended more of Ashford Park than his father pulled down, ma'am. I thought you should have that from me, since I have been here to see both." Evangeline inclined her head. "I thank you, Mr. Calder." She said no more. He said no more. They walked on. She filed the remark beside others she had filed. Upon the Saturday she attended divine service at St. Peter's, Ashford Ruthven, a 12th century parish church with a squat Norman tower of the same honey-coloured Cotswold stone as the great house, box pews of dark oak, polished by 200 winters, brass candlesticks upon the altar. The Duke escorted her in the barouche. They sat in the Ashford pew at the head of the south aisle. The rector read the morning service in an even country voice. Afterwards, at the lych gate, Marcus presented her, one by one, to the principal persons of the village: the rector, the doctor, the miller, the landlord of the inn, the schoolmistress. She gave each her hand. She spoke to each a polite sentence. She did not overdo. The Duke stood a half-pace behind her, and watched, without appearing to watch, as his wife took the village in 3/4 of an hour. Midweek, the first letter from Mrs. Fortescue arrived from Bath, and Evangeline read it twice, at her writing-desk, with the window open and the smell of cut grass coming in faint and sweet. She wrote her answer the same afternoon. 4 careful pages describing the oaks of the park, the bluebells of the home wood, the kindness of Mrs. Gibbons, and the serious goodness of Mr. Calder, saying nothing of her husband beyond that his Grace had been uniformly civil, and that they were beginning, cautiously, a sort of understanding. She sealed it with a plain red wafer, and set it upon the silver tray in the hall. Upon her sitting-room wall, beside the writing-desk, she hung that same week a small miniature of her father, Henry Ashworth, the 4th Earl of Hargreave, in a plain black wooden oval frame, a kind thin face with her own violet blue eyes, powdered brown hair, a high white stock. She did not place it in the long gallery downstairs among the Rutherfords. She did not place it where a servant might point to it. She placed it where only she would see it. She looked at it some mornings before she sat down to her desk. The 7th day of May was a quiet Thursday of steady sun. The post came up from the village a little after 9, and the Duke carried his share into his study after breakfast. Near the bottom of the pile lay a letter from Mr. Stokes of Lincoln's Inn. Marcus broke the black wafer and unfolded it. Within was a second sheet, an extract, neatly copied, from the Bath Parish Registers of St. Michael's on the Hill. Evangeline Beatrice Ashworth, daughter of Henry Ashworth, Earl of Hargreave, and Beatrice Hartwell. Born the 17th of February, 1790. Baptized the 24th of February, 1790. Mr. Stokes's covering letter said, in his small, dry hand, "Your Grace, I pulled the register only to satisfy a small private doubt. Her Grace has already told you what she wished you to know. I send this for your confidential eye only, with no recommendation as to its use. I shall destroy my copy upon your acknowledgement of this letter." Marcus read the extract. He read Mr. Stokes's covering sentences. He set both sheets upon the green leather of the desk and sat a long time in the southern light without moving. The bracket clock upon the chimney-piece ticked. A blackbird sang somewhere in the garden. He did not rise. He did not ring. Once, with the forefinger of his right hand, he touched the small, careful copy of the register, and once he turned it over, and then he sat still again. He had known, since the supper parlour of Easter night, that his wife was Lady Evangeline Ashworth. He had not required Mr. Stokes to confirm it. He understood, however, with a slow, cold gratitude, that Mr. Stokes had acted as a good solicitor acts, and had put the proof into his hand before any other hand should take it up. He did not show the letter to Evangeline. He did not mention at luncheon that any letter from Mr. Stokes had come. That evening after dinner, he went back into the study and wrote in his clean black hand, "Stokes, you were right to send it. Destroy your copy. We have already spoken of her past. She is aware that I know what she has told me. The rest I shall learn, if at all from her own lips, at her own choosing. I am your obliged Ashford." He sealed it with crimson wax and the Ashford signet, laid it upon the tray for the morning post, and burned the extract and Mr. Stokes's covering letter together in the grate. When the fire had finished, he went to bed and slept more soundly than he had slept for a week. Over the following week, a small habit established itself, so quietly that neither of them could have said when it first began. They walked together after breakfast in the walled rose garden upon the south front. The first buds were opening, chiefly the early white ones, and a creamy pink old rose upon the south wall that had been there, Mr. Calder said, since the place was made. The garden was square, enclosed in honey stone, laid in 4 quarters about a small sundial, the gravel paths newly raked, the thrushes busy in the box. They walked a quiet half-hour after the coffee-pot had been cleared. Neither asked the other a question about the past. Marcus told her the story of the house. The third Duke had built it in 1753, after a fire at the old Jacobean place, a little lower in the valley. The 5th Duke had planted the lime avenue upon his marriage. His own mother, as the 6th Duchess, had laid out the rose garden in 1790, the year of her marriage. Evangeline, who was born in the February of that same year, marked the date privately and said nothing. The coincidence struck neither of them as worth a remark, and neither remarked upon it. She told him in return of Bath, of the narrow stair to Mrs. Fortescue's parlour, of the walks upon Beechen Cliff, of a thin elderly Frenchman who gave readings of Racine for 6d. At the assembly rooms, of the books she had read in the last 2 years, the whole of Mrs. Radcliffe, a great deal of Cowper, all of Miss Edgeworth, and a surprising amount of Tacitus in Dr. Murphy's English. Marcus stopped upon the gravel. "Madam, the library at Ashford Park holds 8,000 volumes. You have its free run." She said quietly, "I thank you, Your Grace. I shall use it." She added after a moment, "I offer you, in return, the favour of my company at breakfast each morning in the small green breakfast room. It is a small thing, but it is the only thing I have to offer upon even terms." He said very gravely, "I accept, madame, upon even terms." The small green breakfast room looked eastward over the stable yard and took the morning sun full upon its yellow wallpaper. Coffee was laid at 8:30 with broiled ham, new bread and butter, a pot of Mrs. Gibbons's strawberry preserve, and the London papers 2 days old. She came down in a fresh cap and a plain morning gown. He came in from his early ride in his country coat. They spoke as two people of good breeding speak, of the weather, of the day's business. of the news in the papers. The bracket clock upon the mantel ticked. The Swan, some mornings, could be seen moving out upon the far water. The 14th night was a warm, late May night, the sky a pale, clear black, with a full moon rising above the eastern woods, and the scent of the first, opened roses coming up from the walled garden in a soft, steady drift. After dinner, Evangeline had gone out upon the terrace of the south front, wishing for the cool air before she went up. She wore a pale spring-green muslin morning dress with short puff sleeves and a white lawn fichu at the throat, and a cream cashmere shawl drawn up about her shoulders. The seed pearls lay at her throat. She stood at the stone balustrade, with her gloveless hands composed upon the coping, watching the moon upon the lake, and the single white swan that had pulled itself up upon the farther bank and was sleeping now, with its head folded into its wing. Marcus came out upon the terrace after a short while. He wore his dark green country coat, a buff waistcoat, buff breeches, his brown-topped boots of soft leather. He did not speak at once. He stood a little apart from her, not near, not far, the civil distance of 10 days of habit, with his hand upon the balustrade, and looked with her at the lake. The bracket clock of the drawing-room, through the open window at his back, struck 10 quietly, one silver stroke at a time. At last he said, in his quiet, carrying baritone, "Madame, I have not yet thanked you for the grace with which you have undertaken an arrangement which I offered to you with very little of it." She did not turn her head from the lake at once. After a breath, she turned and looked at him steadily in the moonlight. Her clear violet-blue eyes, very dark under the shawl. "Your Grace," she said, in her soft, warm contralto, "you have thanked me every morning for 10 days, by speaking to me at breakfast as a husband should speak to his wife. I do not require more than that from you. I do not require it yet." He inclined his head. He did not answer. He did not offer her his arm. The swan upon the far bank did not stir. After a little while, she drew the cream shawl more snugly about her shoulders, turned from the balustrade, and went quietly back through the long windows into the drawing-room. He followed at a civil distance. She took up her silver candlestick from the side table in the great hall. She climbed the oaken stair with her hand soft upon the beeswaxed banister. He came to the foot of the stair, and no further. She paused at the turn of the landing and looked back once. He bowed. She inclined her chestnut head. She turned, and the pale green muslin passed into the upper gloom of the east wing, and the door of the blue bedchamber closed, very quietly, upon her lamp. 50 yards away in the west, the door of the ducal suite closed, very quietly, upon his. The bracket clocks upon the landings ticked softly on. The honey-coloured house under the May moon was still. The middle of May came in upon Ashford Park with a soft south wind and the first proper scent of the roses. On the Wednesday, the 18th of the month, the letter that was to send them back to town lay upon the breakfast salver among the London papers, a plain cream-laid envelope, sealed in blue wax with the Pembroke crest. Evangeline, come down in a high-waisted morning gown of pale spring-green muslin with a fresh white lawn fichu at her throat, took it up beside her coffee-cup and broke the seal. Marcus, already at his own place in his dark green country coat, buff waistcoat and buff breeches, waited in the civil silence that had become the habit of 14 days. She read the letter once, and then again. A small card dropped from between the folded pages. "Your Grace," she said, in her soft, warm contralto, "your aunt writes from Upper Brook Street. The Duchess of Portland is giving a ball on the 27th of this month at her house in Cavendish Square. The invitation is upon Lady Pembroke's hall table. The Duchess of Portland has written a particular personal note begging that the new Duke and Duchess of Ashford be present." She turned the card in her fingers. Your Grace, I should wish to go. It is better to go once early than to be known as the Duchess who did not. Marcus set down his cup with a small, precise click. His steel-grey eyes rested upon her a moment under the thick, dark lashes. The faint silver at his temples caught the morning light. "I agree," he said, in his quiet, carrying baritone. "We shall go." The order went out to the stables before the breakfast things were cleared. They went down to town on the Friday and took 3 days in Grosvenor Square for the business of the toilette. London on the Saturday smelt of hot horse and lilac. The plane trees of Grosvenor Square were in full new leaf. Madame Allard came over from Cavendish Place upon the Sunday morning with 2 French assistants, and the ice-silver silk was taken out of its tissue upon Evangeline's dressing-room floor. A cool, pale silver with the faintest shimmer of water in it, cut high-waisted with short puff sleeves, and laid over it a delicate silver tissue, overskirt so fine it would move as a breath of mist above the silk beneath. Madame Allard pinned and clipped and stood back and pronounced that her Grace would do. Lady Pembroke's note came over on the Monday with a small, flat, red leather case. Within, upon cream velvet, lay an heirloom bandeau of old ivory and fine beaten silver, perhaps 60 years old, with a narrow central medallion and 2 slender spreading arms meant to sit close across the brow beneath the chignon. Evangeline lifted it, turned it in the light, set it very gently back. The long white kid gloves came home on the Tuesday. Fine as writing paper, reaching an inch above the elbow, 3 small pearl buttons at the inside of each wrist. The mother's single strand of seed pearls lay in its black velvet case. A small silver fan chased with a running pattern of laurel came with the gloves, Marcus's own choice, sent up to her chamber in silver tissue paper with no note. While the Ashford household made quiet preparation in Grosvenor Square, another household in the Albany was conducting quieter preparations of its own. Lord Julian Rutherford had read the Morning Post announcement of the 23rd of April at 10 in the morning, at his window with the coffee cup half to his lip, and had said one short oath and gone white to the nostrils. He had set the paper down, drunk his coffee, and thought, as he dressed, very hard. By the end of the week he had taken himself to Bath upon the pretence of the waters. He had an acquaintance there, a scrubby young clerk to a Bath attorney, who for a small consideration would look where he was asked to look. The clerk had looked at the parish registers of St. Michael's on the Hill, and for a further small consideration had copied out in a neat, careful hand the baptismal extract of one Evangeline Beatrice Ashworth, daughter of Henry Ashworth, Earl of Hargreave, and Beatrice Hartwell, born the 17th of February, 1790. The copy lay in Julian's pocketbook by the 20th of May. He did not know, for he could not have imagined it of the brother he was pleased to call cold, that Mr. Stokes had drawn the same extract a full fortnight earlier, and that Marcus had held this knowledge, in silence, since the 7th. Julian believed himself in sole possession of a very pretty card, and he was not a man to hold a pretty card long unplayed. He returned to the Albany on the Monday the 23rd, and sent round a civil note to accept the Duchess of Portland's invitation. His plan was of a single clean line. He would stand by the ballroom door as the new Duke and Duchess were announced, put his lips to Cordelia Marchmont's ear, and whisper the true name of the bride. He would trust Cordelia's vanity to do the rest. A cut direct upon the Duchess of Ashford in her first hour at her first Mayfair reception would be done in 3 seconds and would not be forgotten in 3 years. He dressed on the evening of the 27th in his crimson tailcoat with its gilt buttons, a primrose yellow silk waistcoat, buff pantaloons close at the knee, top boots so well polished the tassels showed gold against the black. His wavy honey-blonde hair, fashionably long at the collar, was tied at the nape with a fresh black silk ribbon. His shallow sky-blue eyes were heavy-lidded in the glass. His fair skin showed a London pallor. The small chin dimple came and went as he smiled at his reflection. 5'10" and slim, he let the quizzing glass fall on its crimson ribbon against the yellow waistcoat. The heavy gold watch chain lay across it with 3 enamelled seals. He set his 3 rings upon his hands, 2 plain signets, and, on the little finger of the left, the small emerald, pulled on his white gloves, and went down to his hired chair at 10 minutes to 10. In Mount Street, at the same hour, Miss Cordelia Marchmont was being dressed by a Frenchwoman at her glass. The pale, golden-blonde hair stood in its elaborate coronet, with 2 gold combs set into it, and 3 narrow ropes of small pearls twisted through. Her cornflower blue eyes had been faintly darkened at the lash. Her alabaster skin was carefully powdered. A small painted heart patch sat at the left temple. She was 5'6" and slim in her high-waisted white silk evening gown, with a cluster of small pink silk rosebuds at the hem and a matching cluster at each shoulder. Long white kid gloves were drawn up over the elbow. The pink silk reticule hung from her wrist. The parure of pearls and pink topaz, necklace, earrings, bandeau, sat cool and pretty upon her. Pink silk slippers peeped beneath the hem. She snapped open the spangled pink gauze fan once, practiced the small lift of the chin she had perfected at 15, and was satisfied. Cavendish Square that night was a confusion of torches and link boys and carriages nose to tail from Harley Street down to Wigmore. The Duchess of Portland's house stood upon the north side, every window blazing, the double doors flung wide, the iron area railings lined with curious onlookers. Within the great entrance hall, the black and white marble floor was set with the quiet tread of arrivals. Twin sweeping staircases of honey-coloured Portland stone rose to the first-floor landing upon wrought iron balusters as delicate as lace. Above it all, the great crystal chandelier blazed with 50 candles. At the top of the stair stood Lady Adelaide Pembroke in her high-waisted lavender half-mourning silk with a white lace fichu, a small amethyst cross on its black silk cord at her breast, a pale lavender widow's cap pinned upon her silver coronet. Her shrewd, pale grey eyes missed nothing of the traffic upon the marble below. The Ashford carriage drew up at the door at 10 precisely. Marcus descended first, in his black superfine evening tailcoat, high white starched cravat, white silk waistcoat fine embroidered in silver, black satin knee breeches, white silk stockings, buckled black evening shoes, the Ashford signet upon his right hand, and a thin gold watch chain at his waist. He turned and gave Evangeline his hand. She came down into the torchlight in her ice-silver silk, the delicate silver tissue overskirt lifting a hair's breadth with the May air, the seed pearls white at her throat, the ivory and silver bandeau gleaming upon her smooth, dark chestnut chignon. Her long white kid gloves were drawn above the elbow. The small silver fan hung at her wrist. Her clear violet-blue eyes went once along the queue of carriages and came quietly back to her husband's hand. She laid her gloved fingers upon his arm. He inclined his head. They passed through the blaze of the hall, across the marble, up the honey-coloured stair, with Lady Pembroke descending to meet them halfway. At the turn of the landing, Marcus gave his other arm to his aunt. The 3 went up together the last 7 steps, and the ballroom door stood open before them, and the master of ceremonies, a small stout man in black with a silver-headed wand, drew breath, consulted his list, struck his wand once upon the parquet, and said in a clear carrying tone across the ante-room, "His Grace, the Duke of Ashford, and the Duchess of Ashford." Julian Rutherford was already at the ballroom door, with Cordelia Marchmont upon the inner edge of the first group. He had been speaking to her quietly for perhaps 2 minutes. He said, "Now," as if the thought had just come to him, his lips not an inch from the pale pearl of her ear. "Her real name is Ashworth. Her father was Hargreave, the fellow who was ruined at cards in 2002. Penniless. A companion in Bath. Pure Grub Street." Cordelia's cornflower blue eyes widened half a line. Her pink fan paused upon the opening stroke. Her small painted heart patch shivered once at the temple. A slow, half-amused smile gathered at her pouting pink mouth, the overused, practiced smile a little sharper at its edge than she meant it to be. She shut the fan, set her chin up the practiced half-inch, and moved with unhurried grace across the polished parquet toward the centre of the room, where the new Duchess of Ashford stood a pace in advance of her husband and a pace behind her husband's aunt. Cordelia meant to reach her in a dozen steps, upon the pretence of seeking an introduction, and to be the first woman in Mayfair to know her. She had come 3 paces. She was lifting her chin for the 4th. Lady Pembroke came down off the last step of the stair upon Marcus's arm. She did not turn her head to Cordelia. She did not hasten. She did precisely what a woman of 54 years of breeding does in such a moment, which was to speak, in her clearest drawing-room voice, pitched no louder than her usual and carrying across 10 groups at the foot of the stair as a silver bell carries across a quiet courtyard. "I regret, Miss Marchmont, that I do not know you. My niece by marriage is at my elbow. You will, I think, excuse me." She swept on into the ballroom with Evangeline beside her. The hush that followed fell in 3 slow heartbeats. The 10 nearest groups understood in the first heartbeat what had been said. In the second, who had said it, and to whom? In the third, what at Mayfair's own price it was worth. Fans paused in mid-flutter. A dowager at the foot of the stair set her lorgnette to her eye, and did not trouble to lower it. An elderly general inclined his head half an inch toward his partner, and smiled into his cravat. Cordelia stood in her high-waisted white silk, her pink gauze fan half lifted, upon the exposed piece of parquet between the stair and the centre of the room, and became, in the space of 8 seconds, conspicuously alone. Down the last step of the stair at that moment came the Duchess of Portland herself, a handsome woman of 52, her silver hair smoothly dressed with an amethyst bandeau across the brow, at amethysts at ears and bosom, a high-waisted evening gown of deep plum silk, falling long and straight from beneath the bust. She had seen the whole thing from the ante-room above. She walked across the marble without haste, and she held out her right hand to Evangeline with a small, direct smile that was not a smile of pity or of politics, but the smile of a hostess who has come to welcome a guest whose quality she has already measured and approved. "Duchess," she said, clear and warm and perfectly audible, "I am so very glad you are come. Let me take you in." She drew Evangeline's gloved hand through the bend of her arm and walked her with Lady Pembroke upon the other side, into the full blaze and company of the centre of the room. The matter was settled, as these matters are settled in Mayfair, in 40 seconds. Julian Rutherford, at the door, had gone white to the fair skin. The quizzing-glass dropped an inch upon its crimson ribbon against the primrose waistcoat and swung twice and stilled. He closed his shallow sky-blue eyes for the smallest part of a breath, opened them, bowed slightly to no one, and withdrew through the long curtained doorway upon his left, toward the supper-room. He would pass the next 3 hours there over a glass of claret. He did not drink, and come away from the Portland house before the supper hour proper, and spend the following morning at his tailor's ordering a coat he did not want. Cordelia Marchmont stood a moment longer alone upon the parquet, snapped her pink gauze fan shut at last, turned, not sharply, she was too well bred for that, and withdrew to the chairs along the wall where the elder lady sat. Before the half-hour struck, she had sent for her carriage. She was not seen in a London drawing room for the remainder of that season. The band in the Musicians' Gallery struck up the first set at a nod from the Duchess of Portland, and the business of the ball resumed. Evangeline was presented in form to her hostess's eldest son, Lord George Osborne, a brown-haired young man of 24 with pleasant hazel eyes and a very creditable country dancer's address, who led her out for the first 2 dances with a careful civility and the small grave air of a young man aware he had been given an office. He spoke of his mother's new roses at Welbeck, and of a pair of matched bays he had lately bought in the north, and she answered in her soft contralto with the composed interest of a woman who had not forgotten how to make a young man feel himself agreeable. When the set ended, he restored her, with a bow, to her husband. The band had paused. Then the leader lifted his bow, and the opening 3/4 beat of a Viennese waltz came slowly down upon the great room. Marcus inclined his head to her. He held out his gloved hand. She laid hers in it without a word. He led her, between the parting couples, into the space that opened at the centre of the parquet, set his right hand very lightly at the small of her back, above the silver tissue, took her right hand in his left at the proper height, and began the slow turning pattern of the dance. It was the first waltz Evangeline had stood up to since girlhood. She had feared she might have forgotten the step. She had not. Her ice-silver silk moved in a slow, pale circle against the honey gleam of the parquet. The silver tissue overskirt whispered once at each turn. Above them, the great chandelier burned like firelight upon 200 candles, and the light ran softly over his thick, jet-black hair, where it had begun to silver at the temples and caught in the seed pearls at her throat. His steel-grey eyes were steady upon hers. His gloved hand at her waist was as light as courtesy required, and not a particle lighter. At the second turn, he gave her, for the smallest part of a second, a grave, quiet smile meant for no one else in the room. She did not smile back. She returned the look once, level and steady, and inclined her chestnut head the smallest fraction, and the waltz went on. No person who watched those 2 figures in their slow, composed circle was in any serious doubt thereafter of the quality of the match. The supper was called at midnight. The Duchess of Portland took Evangeline into the supper-room upon her own arm and placed her at her own right hand. The Dowager Duchess of Devonshire, seated immediately opposite, turned to her once over the consommé and said, "My dear Duchess, I knew your grandfather Ashworth a little 40 years ago. He had very much your way of sitting still at a table." And then, as Evangeline inclined her head with a composed, "Your Grace is very kind," returned her attention to her glass. The room was full of quiet, confidential talk, and the silver clatter of spoons, and the easy laughter of people who have understood, an hour since, where a newcomer is to be placed. Dancing resumed at 1:30. Evangeline stood up for 2 further sets, with an elderly cousin of Lady Pembroke's, and with a cheerful young colonel of the Guards, and sat out one, watching the dancers in a pleased, quiet tiredness. The band played until 4. The candles of the great chandelier had burnt down 1/3 of their length, when at last she gave her hand to her husband upon the sweep of the honey staircase, and descended across the black and white marble. They went home, through a Mayfair that had begun, under its smoky linkmen, to turn grey. The first milk carts were clattering out of the mews. A single early sparrow spoke from a plane tree. The sky above Grosvenor Square was the pale silver of lifted rain. Evangeline sat in her corner of the carriage with her cloak loose upon her shoulders. The ivory and silver bandeau had loosened a little in the dark chestnut chignon during the last set, and a small strand had come down at her temple. She said at last, into the quiet roll of the wheels. Your Grace, your aunt has won my war for me this evening. I shall not forget it. Marcus, in his corner opposite her, his black superfine dark against the cushion, answered without turning his head from the window. She has won her own war, madame. You gave her the weapon. They did not speak further. The carriage drew up at Ashford House. He handed her down upon the step. He gave her his arm across the hall, up the oak staircase, along the quiet upper corridor to the door of her chamber. She gave him her gloved hand. He bowed over it and set his lips, once formally, to her gloved knuckles, a kiss as brief and as ceremonious as a court bow, and he bade her a formal good night. He had been her husband 5 weeks and 4 days. He had not crossed the corridor. An hour later, in his study at the back of the house, a single wax light burning upon the desk and a single glass of claret untouched beside it, Marcus Rutherford sat very still. The house was silent. He did not move. He thought of the woman who had just danced a waltz in his arms. He thought of the composure with which she had walked across the parquet beside his aunt and been drawn by a duchess into the centre of a room. He thought of the small strand of chestnut that had come down at her temple in the carriage, and of the level violet-blue look she had given him at the second turn of the dance. He thought, without evasion and without pride, of the baptismal extract from St. Michael's on the Hill that had lain upon his desk for a fortnight past, and of the 7 weeks in which he had chosen, day upon day, to say nothing of what he knew. He thought of his father, and of his brother, and of a Saturday afternoon at Easter that had begun as a small, cold plan, and had, with no warning he could now retrace, ceased to be that. He did not permit himself to name what it had become. He only sat. The wax light burned down upon the stick. The grey of Grosvenor Square at the shutter turned slowly to the colder grey of full dawn, and then to a pale rising blue. A cock, somewhere in the mews, cried once. He blew out the candle at last and stood. He climbed the oaken stair in his stockinged tread so as not to wake her. At the turn of the landing, he paused a single heartbeat, looking along the corridor to the east, where, at its far end, her door was closed upon her sleep. He bowed his jet-black head a fraction, as a man bows at the door of a room he does not enter, and he went on past to the west. The door of the ducal suite closed upon him very quietly. He had not crossed the corridor, even now. Thursday the 2nd of June, 1814, came up mild and clear over Grosvenor Square. 6 days had passed since the Portland ball. Evangeline, in her high-waisted, pale muslin morning gown, with a white lawn fichu at her throat and her dark chestnut hair coiled smoothly at the nape, had come down a little late to breakfast. She had taken her coffee, exchanged a civil word upon the weather with her husband, who read the Morning Chronicle opposite her in his dark blue tailcoat, and had gone up by 10:30 to her sitting-room on the first floor. She was settling to a half-finished sheet when a soft knock fell upon the door. "If you please, Your Grace," said Sarah Coombs in her low Bath voice, holding the small silver salver out at the civil angle. "There is a letter come up for you. It was brought by hand, and Pillman asked it be given into your own." Evangeline took the letter and thanked her. It was a plain square of good-laid paper, directed in a careful copper-plate hand to Her Grace, the Duchess of Ashford, Ashford House, Grosvenor Square, and sealed with a round impression of black wax bearing the device of a fleur-de-lis. Her violet-blue eyes considered the black wax without hurry. She took up her ivory paper knife, slid it beneath the seal, and broke it. The letter was dated Albany, Wednesday night, the 1st of June, 1814. She read, "Madame, Your Grace will forgive the liberty of a private communication from one whose name has been, since your marriage, so little upon your husband's lips. I write in the civil hope that the matter I lay before you may be disposed of between ourselves, without troubling his grace. It has come to my knowledge, through channels I shall not trouble you to inquire into, that the name under which you were entered at St. George's, Hanover Square, on the 22nd of April, Evangeline Hartwell, was not the name to which you were born. The parish register of St. Michael's on the hill at Bath has afforded me a baptismal extract dated the 24th of February, 1790, for one Evangeline Beatrice Ashworth, daughter of Henry Ashworth, late Earl of Hargreave. I am not mistaken in taking this to be yourself. Your Grace will understand how painful this knowledge must be, were it to come to my brother by any channel but your own. My father, the 7th Duke, was of that private party in Bolton Street in October of 1802, at which the late Earl of Hargreave was ruined at cards. A matter of family record, since the 7th Duke Charles was the father equally of myself and of Marcus. To lay the Ashworth name before his Grace would be to touch an old and tender sore of our own house as nearly as of yours. I will not do so. I will keep your secret as faithfully as if it were my own. I ask in return only that you see your way, from your own private quarterly allowance, and without communication to my brother, to the discreet advancing of a private loan of £8,000, payable in quarterly instalments of £2,000, to begin at the next Lady Day. I have the honour to remain your Grace's devoted brother, Julian Rutherford. Evangeline did not move. She set the page flat upon the blotter and read the letter a second time with the same unhurried composure. When she had finished, she folded it along its original folds and sat a minute with her fingertips resting lightly upon the folded edge. She did not rise to the fire. She did not look at the grate. She took up her reticule of plain dark silk, placed the folded letter within, drew the ribbon close, and rang the bell. "Sarah," she said, when her maid appeared, "will you have the carriage ordered for 11:15? I shall wear the dark blue morning gown. You may lay out the plain straw bonnet with the dark blue ribbon." Sarah, whose dark hair was drawn smoothly back under her white cap, curtsied and went. Evangeline was dressed within 15 minutes. The dark navy silk morning gown with its white lawn fichu crossed at the throat, her mother's seed pearls within it, her gloves drawn smooth, the reticule with the letter in it hung from her wrist. She met her own eyes in the pier glass, inclined her chestnut head a degree to her own reflection, and walked across the corridor to her husband's study. She knocked once. "Come," said Marcus's quiet baritone. She opened the door and went in. He was at his writing table with a ledger open and a quill in his hand. He looked up, saw her dressed for out of doors, laid down the quill and rose. "Your Grace," she said, in her soft, warm contralto, "I have had a letter this morning from your brother, Lord Julian. I believe you should read it before I answer it." She crossed the Turkey carpet, drew the folded square from her reticule, and laid it upon the desk between them. Then she took the chair opposite his, composed, ivory pale, her gloved hands settled in her lap. Marcus did not speak. He sat down, took up the letter, unfolded it, and read. His steel-grey eyes moved steadily down the page, and his face did not change. The faint silver at his temples caught the window light once as he turned the sheet. He read to the signature, then lifted his eyes. They were not cold at her. They were entirely cold, in a still, quiet, perfectly controlled fashion, at the piece of paper in his hand. "Madam," he said at length, "I will not ask you whether you wished me to read it. You would not have brought it if you did not. I am in your debt for the trust of this hour. I will answer this letter myself. You will permit me?" "I wish you to answer it, Your Grace," she said. "I do not wish him to be answered in my name." He inclined his head, drew a clean sheet toward him, wrote a single line, blotted it, held the stick of crimson sealing wax to the candle, dropped a bright circle upon the fold, and pressed the Ashford signet, the raven on its chained sword, into it. He set the sealed note aside. "I shall deal with my brother this afternoon," he said. "I should like you, if you will, to take the carriage to my aunt's for the day. I shall send for you when it is done." She did not rise. She said, very level, "Your Grace, may I be present?" He looked up. For the first time in 7 weeks of marriage, his face changed fully. It was not a large change. To a stranger it might have passed for nothing. The firm mouth softened 1/4 of an inch. The line between the dark brows loosened. The steel-grey eyes lost, for 2 heartbeats, the cool, controlled distance that was his settled habit, and she saw behind it the private man, grave and quite deeply moved. "Madam," he said, "you may be present if you wish. I should prefer that you were not. I should prefer that you were not obliged to be in a room with a man who has written you such a letter. But I will not forbid it. You are my wife, and the matter concerns the name you have given me. If you wish to be present, you shall be." "I shall be," she said. He inclined his head once. "Then I have work to do before 2 o'clock." She rose, curtsied very slightly, and left him to it. What he did in the next 2 hours was done upon paper. He sent for Mr. Stokes. He sent a line by Pillman to the second footman, James Harrow, to be in the hall at 1:45, with orders to admit Lord Julian at the striking of the hour. He wrote another line to Lord Julian himself, sent by a boy to the Albany, requesting his brother at 2 upon a matter of family business. Mr. Stokes arrived from Lincoln's Inn at 12 precisely, in his plain black superfine tailcoat, his leather portfolio under one arm. Marcus set the Albany letter in his hand, without a word. Mr. Stokes read it through once, the small gold-rimmed spectacles low upon his nose. When he reached the closing line, he did not exclaim. He set the letter down, took off his spectacles, polished them, and said, in his quiet, dry voice, "Your Grace, Newgate." "Not yet, Stokes," said Marcus as quietly. "He is my father's son also. I will give him one choice. If he declines it, I shall come to you before dinner." "Very good, Your Grace." Mr. Stokes opened his portfolio upon the desk. They worked through till 1:30, drafting the particulars of a settlement. £4,000 per annum for Lord Julian's life, charged upon specified Ashford lands, the conditions precedent, the instrument of confession to be signed in the same session, the Albany letter to be endorsed by Julian as withdrawn. The servants' hall knew only that his lordship was expected at 2 upon a matter of business. Pillman passed the note to Harrow and laid out the library. The library faced north upon the garden, a long, quiet room with 8,000 volumes on mahogany shelves. It was set now for a paper business. Marcus's writing table was cleared and dressed. Fresh paper, a cut-glass inkstand, 2 new quills, 2 sticks of sealing wax in crimson and black, a silver sandcaster, the rocker and the seal. At the small rosewood table by the easternmost window, a plain green leather volume of Cowper's poems had been set, closed, for Evangeline's hand. Mr. Stokes took his station at the side table with his portfolio open. There was no brandy at the hearth. There were no weapons in the room. At 10 minutes to 2, Evangeline came down, still in the dark blue morning gown, the bonnet left off, her chignon very smooth. She went into the library without speaking, took her chair at the rosewood table, set her gloved hands folded upon the closed Cowper, and looked quietly out at the plane trees. The long case clock in the hall struck 2. A carriage drew up in the street. A rap fell upon the front door. Pillman's measured tread crossed the marble. A pause, a civil murmur, a step upon the staircase, and the library door opened. "Lord Julian Rutherford, Your Grace," said Pillman, and withdrew. Julian had come from Albany in his crimson tailcoat with its gilt buttons, a primrose-yellow silk waistcoat, buff pantaloons, top boots with gold tassels, the quizzing glass on its crimson ribbon, 3 rings upon his hands. His wavy, honey-blonde hair was tied at the nape with a thin black silk ribbon. The fair skin had its London pallor. The small chin dimple came and went. He stepped 2 paces into the room, saw Marcus at the writing table, saw Mr. Stokes at the side table, and at that moment his shallow sky-blue eyes went on across the carpet to the easternmost window, where a slender woman in dark blue silk sat composedly with her gloved hands folded upon a closed book. His face twitched once at the corner of the mouth, but did not become any expression before it was gone. "Marcus," he said, and then carefully, "Your Grace." "Julian," said Marcus, "sit down, if you please." Julian sat in the chair set out for him opposite the writing table. He laid his hat and his gloves upon his knee. He did not again look toward the window. Marcus took up the Albany letter. He did not raise his voice. He did not alter his pace. He read the letter through aloud, from dating line to signature, in the even-carrying baritone of a man at a board meeting. He read the line about the 7th Duke at the Bolton Street card party. He read the civil request for the £8,000 and the quarterly instalments beginning at Lady Day. He read the closing, "Devoted brother." He read the signature. He laid the letter down. There was a silence of, perhaps, 4 seconds. "Julian," said Marcus, "I shall tell you now what I know, so that you shall not be obliged to guess. I have known since the 7th of May that my wife is Lady Evangeline Ashworth, daughter of Henry Ashworth, late Earl of Hargreave." Mr. Stokes drew the baptismal extract a fortnight after the wedding and sent it to me privately. I did not tell her I held it, because upon the evening of our wedding she had told me, of her own free voice, what she wished me to know, and the rest was not mine to demand. Mr. Stokes, who is present, holds the written instruction under which he shall take whatever steps I shall direct. You are in no position of secret advantage over either of us. You are upon dry ground, and you are alone. Julian's fair skin had gone pale to the collar. He did not speak. He looked once at Mr. Stokes, who did not look back at him. "A lesser man," said Marcus, who had written to the Duchess of Ashford in the terms of that letter, would be in Newgate prison tomorrow morning. "Mr. Stokes is of that opinion. I am of it also. You are not a lesser man by station. You are my father's son. I shall therefore offer you a choice, and I shall ask your answer before 4 o'clock. He took up a clean sheet from the desk. Mr. Stokes had drawn it in the forenoon in his small, clear hand. Marcus read. "First, you may withdraw this letter in writing before 4 o'clock today, endorsing the original as withdrawn over your own signature and seal. You may write, under this roof, a full private confession to myself and to Mr. Stokes that you have attempted the extortion of £8,000 from the Duchess of Ashford by the threat of exposing to your brother her family name. You may, upon those instruments being signed and witnessed, accept a settlement of £4,000 per annum for the term of your life, charged upon the Ashford estate upon 2 conditions: that you shall never again, in any public or private room, mention the Duchess of Ashford in any but the most courteous terms, and that you shall reside at a distance of not less than 100 miles from Ashford Park and Grosvenor Square, except by my written permission. Second, you may decline. In that case I shall lay this letter before Mr. Stokes this evening, and he shall prosecute you for the attempted extortion of my wife. Third, you may attempt to bluster. In that case, Pillman and Harrow will, within the hour, remove you from this house by the front door, and the matter shall proceed as upon the second option, with the advantage, to the servants' hall, of a scene." He laid the sheet down. "Choose, Julian. he said. Julian sat a long moment, his hand upon the crown of his hat opened and closed once. His shallow sky-blue eyes went, in spite of himself, across to the easternmost window. Evangeline did not look back at him. Her gloved hands lay folded upon the closed cowper. Her violet-blue eyes rested, with a composed neutrality that was neither scorn nor reproach, upon the plane trees beyond the glass. He looked back. "Marcus," he said, and his voice caught at the corners of the word. "My God, don't make a cat of me in front of—" "Julian," said Marcus quite quietly. "My wife is present because she chooses to be. Choose, please." Julian closed his eyes for the smallest fraction of a breath. When he opened them again, he had chosen. "The first," he said. "Very well, Mr. Stokes." Mr. Stokes rose, bringing his portfolio to the writing table. He set out a clean sheet, the inkstand, a freshly cut quill, and the fair-copied draft of the confession. He said, "If your lordship will be so good," and stood back. Julian took up the quill. Under Marcus's eye he wrote out his confession in his own hand, at Mr. Stokes's dictation, where any word had been left to be particular. The scratch of the quill upon the paper was the only sound in the room for 15 minutes. Then he signed at the foot, "Julian Rutherford," in his narrow hand, and laid the quill down. Mr. Stokes signed as witness, dried the ink with sand from the caster, and set the confession aside. He drew the settlement forward, laid it before Julian, and read its clauses aloud. Julian sat through the reading without a word. At the end he signed in 2 places, and Mr. Stokes in 2 as witness. Lastly, the Albany letter itself was laid before him. He took the crimson wax, held it to the candle, dropped a bright circle upon the foot of the folded sheet, and pressed the fleur-de-lis of the black ring upon his little finger into it, his endorsement of withdrawal written above in his own hand. He handed the letter across to Marcus without raising his eyes. The long case clock in the hall struck 6. Julian rose. He took up his hat and gloves. Marcus stood, and did not put out his hand. Julian did not put out his. Julian walked to the door, and there paused 1/2 second, as a man pauses who thinks he should say one thing further. And then he went out. He had spoken no word to the woman at the window, and she had not looked at him as he left. Pillman closed the library door softly behind him. Mr. Stokes fastened the strap of his portfolio, laid the signed confession and settlement into Marcus's hand, bowed to Evangeline at the window with the small, grave formality that was his only compliment, received Marcus's quiet, "I am in your debt, Stokes," and withdrew. Marcus sat a long time at his desk, with the signed confession in his hand. He did not read it. He held it flat upon his palm, as a man might hold a small weight long lain upon his chest, and lift it at last. The June light had gone from the clean white of noon to the softer gold of late afternoon. At the easternmost window, Evangeline sat in composed stillness, her gloved hands folded upon the closed cowper, her eyes upon the garden. At last, he set the confession down. He rose. He crossed the carpet to her and stopped a civil pace from her chair. She looked up. "Madame," he said, very low, "I have not thanked you for the letter you brought me at 10 this morning. I thank you now. I shall try to thank you properly for the rest of a great many years." He held out his hand. She laid her gloved fingers in his palm. He closed his own hand over them and held them a single quiet moment. He did not raise her hand. He did not kiss it. He only held it. And then he released her and bowed. "I shall send for the carriage. Lady Pembroke will expect you at my aunt's for dinner. I shall join you at 7. She inclined her chestnut head. "Your Grace," she said. That was all. A quarter of an hour later, the Ashford carriage stood at the door. The footman had handed her Grace up the step, and the horses stepped out into the late afternoon sun. The square lay gold under the westering light. The plane trees threw their long shadows upon the paving. The carriage went round the square at the civil pace, and out by the south, down into Berkeley Square, where the sun struck warm upon the upper stories of the houses, and up by Mount Street into Upper Brook Street, where Lady Adelaide Pembroke had her narrow stone-fronted house upon the north side. Evangeline sat in the corner of the carriage with her gloved hands folded, the bonnet tied neat, her reticule upon her knee. The Albany letter was no longer in it. The worst thing that had happened in her 10 weeks of marriage was over, and had been handled well. She found, rather to her own surprise, that she was neither triumphant nor shaken. She was quietly warm in the chest, as a person is warm who has stood close to a good hearth. The carriage drew up at the steps of Upper Brook Street at 4:30. The footman handed her down. The hall porter bowed her in. She went up the shallow stone stair to the drawing-room on the first floor. Lady Pembroke came to her with her hands out. "My dear," she said, in her shrewd, warm, patrician voice. She was in high-waisted lavender, half-mourning silk, and her pale lavender widow's cap, the small amethyst cross upon its black silk cord at her breast. "You have been in the sun. You are too pale. Come to the fire. Marcus has written me the merest note. Sit down. I shall give you tea." Evangeline laid her gloved hand in Lady Pembroke's and let herself be drawn across the pale Aubusson carpet to the low chair by the fender, and took the cup that was put into her hand. And the soft, patrician voice, which had asked no question and would ask none, went on with an account of a new horse Lord Pembroke's nephew had bought upon the Wednesday, and of a comic letter come up from Bath that morning from Mrs. Fortescue, and Evangeline, warming her fingers upon the thin china cup, and setting her shoulders against the kind high back of the chair, listened and smiled once, and said very little, and was content. They went down to Oxfordshire together upon the Friday, 3 full days after the library at Grosvenor Square had seen the last of Lord Julian Rutherford, in the larger of the Ashford carriages, Lady Pembroke upon the seat opposite, the June sun bright upon the hedges. Mrs. Sarah Coombs followed with the trunks in the second chaise. Lady Pembroke, who was to remain at Ashford Park for a fortnight, read aloud such small items as pleased her from the Morning Post. Marcus, beside his wife, did not often speak, but once in the long climb out of Henley, he laid his gloved hand briefly upon Evangeline's, where it rested on her knee, and left it there for the space of 10 of the carriage's slow breaths before he drew it away. They arrived at the honey-coloured front of Ashford Park at 6:30, the lime avenue in its full summer leaf, the rose garden a great flushed pink bank of blossom beyond the south parterre. Mrs. Gibbons dropped a curtsy and said, with the quiet warmth of a housekeeper who had been hoping for this return, "Her Grace is very welcome home." Evangeline answered her by name and went along the line of servants, not missing one. Mrs. Fortescue was sent for from Bath within the week and installed in the Rose Suite at the head of the south wing. She presented Evangeline with a new white lace cap with narrow violet ribbons, with the bashful modesty of a woman who had not expected, at 62, to be any duchess's particular guest. Evangeline kissed her upon both cheeks. Lady Pembroke carried her off to the south parterre, and was heard, from the drawing-room window, to laugh aloud. In the second week of Mrs. Fortescue's stay, Evangeline went down with Mr. Calder to the walled kitchen garden, and marked out a bed 12 feet by 3. "White narcissus, Mr. Calder," she said, "in Mrs. Fortescue's name. They shall come up every March for as long as the wall stands." Calder took off his hat. "Ma'am, I shall see it set in October. She had hung privately beside her writing desk upstairs the little miniature of her father Henry Ashworth, 4th Earl of Hargreave, a young man's face, painted at 26, fine and fair and a little too sensitive about the mouth. She did not hang him in the long gallery with the Rutherfords, nor downstairs where he would look across at the steel-eyed portrait of the man who had broken him. She set him by her desk, where he could watch her write her letters, and she was content, and said nothing of it to anyone. Late in June, upon a Tuesday morning of clear, warm weather, she went walking after breakfast in the home wood along the upper ride, the beech canopy in full new leaf, the sun falling in coin-bright patches upon the leaf mould. She had gone half a mile when she heard a tall man's step behind her, and Marcus came up alongside without speaking and matched his pace to hers. They walked so for 5 minutes without a word. At the old sweet chestnut where the path divided, he stopped. "Evangeline," he said. He had begun, very sparingly, to use her Christian name within doors when no servant was by, though never yet in any other place. "I have walked up here this morning because I find I should like to tell you a thing, and I should prefer to tell you under the trees than in any room of the house." She inclined her head and waited. He told her then, standing under the sweet chestnut, the whole of it. His father's temper, the closed doors at Ashford when he had been a small boy, his mother's long, slow illness, and her death in the winter of his 12th year, the cold Yorkshire stepmother who had followed within the 12-month, the younger brother born of that second marriage, and left too much to nursemaids and too little to any governing hand, his father's death at 58 of an apoplexy in the hunting field in November 1810, the codicil, the brother. He told it evenly, without heat, but he told it whole, without a single pause for her to supply a kindly interjection, which she did not offer, for she had judged at the first sentence that he wished to be let to tell the thing through. When he had finished, he was silent for perhaps 20 seconds. Then he said very quietly, "I have not, since my father's death, had a confidant on the matter. I find I should like one. I offer you the post if you will take it. I do not offer it as a task. I offer it because I trust no one else to hear it." Evangeline did not answer him at once. She stood with her gloved hand resting upon the grey bark of the sweet chestnut and looked past him down the long ride where the sun fell in its warm slanted bars upon the leaf mould. She was silent, by his own afterward reckoning, for perhaps 30 seconds. Then she said, "Your Grace, I accept the post. I shall take it very gravely. I shall not, in return, ever expect you to undertake the Ashworth side of the old story except at your own choosing. I can bear it alone. I have borne it for 12 years. He looked at her with his steel-grey eyes gone, for the first time in her sight, entirely open. "You will not bear it alone hereafter, madame," he said. "If you will permit me." She inclined her chestnut head under the brim of the straw bonnet. They walked home down the ride together without touching, but when she sat down to her writing desk at 11 and looked across it at the miniature of her father, she found her eyes had gone wet, and she did not trouble to dry them for some minutes. It was 7 days after that walk, Lady Pembroke gone back to town, Mrs. Fortescue returned to Bath, that the thing happened in the library at Ashford Park in the long, soft blue of a summer dusk. Marcus had been at the long oak table with a folio of Horace open before him for an hour. Evangeline, coming down from her sitting-room with a letter she had meant to post, had stopped beside his chair and, leaning a little over his shoulder, had set her hand upon the page and had begun softly to read aloud the line beneath her finger. The second ode of the third book, the well-worn tag about what is sweet and fitting. He did not turn his head. He set his own hand, bare, over hers upon the book. Her glove went quiet beneath his palm. They were so both perfectly still for the length of half a minute. Her warm chestnut hair, coming down a little from its pins in the afternoon's heat, just touched his jaw at the edge of the faint silver scar. She did not draw back. He turned his head, slowly, and kissed her. Once, gently, closed mouth, upright, the single careful kiss of a man who has not permitted himself to do any such thing for a great many weeks, and is not now going to do any more than he has permitted himself. She did not draw back. She set her cheek against his temple for 3 quiet seconds. "Marcus," she said. It was the first time she had spoken his Christian name aloud in his hearing. "Evangeline," he said, and his deep, clear voice had gone rough in a way she had not heard it before. "I have been very stupid for 43 days. She was not smiling. She was too moved for that. But her soft mouth at the corner gave the very small, dry flicker that was the whole of her wit. And she said, 7 weeks is a short stupidity. I have heard of worse." He laughed then, low, once. He did not release her hand for a long moment. When at last he did, she straightened, settled her hair with a slow pin, and went quietly out of the library. She walked up to her sitting room, sat down at her writing desk, looked once at her father's miniature, and went on with her letter with a hand not quite steady for the first 2 lines. July came in hot and fair upon the Cotswold. Each evening after dinner, Marcus came up by the back stair with a book under his arm and read to her for an hour. Cowper and Gray, and once a new book of Miss Austen's that Lady Pembroke had sent down with a laconic note. She mended or sewed or simply listened. By day they walked in the deer park, or rode. She was mounted upon a quiet grey mare called Lyra, whom Marcus had chosen for her at the Banbury Fair. He taught her the estate accounts in unhurried stages. She had a clear head for figures from her Bath years. She took to the Ashford books quickly. By the 3rd week of July, Mr. Calder, going to the Duke with a draft memorandum upon the new drainage scheme for the Lower Meadows, found himself redirected to her Grace's writing desk, and discovered she had already pencilled in the margin 3 sensible observations, one of which saved £40 in the labour of the cut. Calder came away saying, to no one in particular, that her Grace had a very nice hand for a ledger. Late in the month, upon a still warm Thursday evening, Marcus and Evangeline sat alone together in the library. He had come in from the estate office with a folded paper in his hand. She knew the paper, for she had signed it at Mr. Stokes's dictation the day before her wedding, and he laid it upon the small table at her elbow, and said in his quiet voice, "Evangeline, I shall not need this. I believe you shall not either." She looked at the folded paper. It was the deed containing Clause 8 of the prenuptial contract, her private right, once in 5 years, by mutual deed of separation, to dissolve any portion of the marriage beyond the legal tie. She laid her sewing aside. She said very quietly, "No, I shall not." He tore the paper cleanly across and across again, and laid the pieces upon the library fire. They curled brown and went up in a clean flame. He sat down opposite her. Neither said anything further upon it. She took up her sewing. It was upon a Wednesday evening in the small green breakfast room at the beginning of September that she told him. They had sat down to a late supper of cold fowl and raspberries. The long soft gold of the September evening came in through the west windows. She waited until he had finished his claret. Then she said, without lifting her eyes from her plate, "Marcus, I had rather tell you here than elsewhere. I am with child. Dr. Hughes was with me yesterday morning. He is of opinion that the child will come toward the end of April." He set down his knife very carefully. He did not speak. He stood up from his chair, crossed the 3 paces of polished floor between them, and knelt beside her chair in the last low sun through the west window, and took her hand in both of his, and kissed it once gently upon the knuckles, above the plain gold ring he had set there in April at St. George's, Hanover Square. "Madam," he said, and then, "Lo, Evangeline, I did not dare hope so soon." She laid her other hand upon his dark hair for the briefest instant and drew it away. "Nor I," she said. "I am very glad, Marcus." He did not rise at once. He stayed a long moment beside her chair, his forehead bent a little toward their joined hands, and then he stood and drew her up, and they went slowly together into the library, where the small fire was already laid, and he sat beside her upon the sofa for an hour, and did not read any book at all. The Michaelmas dinner fell upon the 29th of September, a Thursday, in weather of the clear soft gold that the Cotswold keeps for the end of that month. Lady Pembroke had come down from London on the Monday. Mrs. Fortescue up from Bath on the Tuesday, in a new grey and violet half-mourning that had been Lady Pembroke's loving bullying. Mr. Stokes on the Wednesday in his usual plain black. Reverend Harling had walked across the park from the rectory at Ashford Ruthven an hour before dinner in his black cassock and white bands. The great dining-room had been aired for a week under Mrs. Gibbons's iron direction. The long mahogany table, polished until the Ashford livery of the 6 waiting footmen showed in it, was set for 24. The silver gilt was out, the heavy Rutherford candelabra down the centre, the gilt-edged dessert service, 4 silver epignes bearing hothouse grapes and peaches. The damask cloth was the heavy old Irish pattern. The beeswax candles had been lit at 6:45. At the far end of the room, above the sideboard, hung the single portrait of Charles Rutherford, 7th Duke of Ashford, painted by Lawrence in 1799. The dark brows drawn together above a cold, clear grey gaze, the garter robes heavy upon the shoulders. He looked down the length of his son's table in painted silence and saw it laid for 24, and did not speak. Evangeline, who had chosen to hang her father's miniature beside her writing desk upstairs, rather than in any room where he should be obliged to sit under Charles Rutherford's eye, went down the grand staircase at 5 minutes before the half-hour in her soft rose-pink silk gown, high-waisted and gentle in its line. For she was 4 months gone, and the shape of it lay kindly upon the very slight softening at her waist, with the white lawn fichu at her throat, her mother's single strand of seed pearls below it, a cream cashmere shawl over her arm. There was a quiet, private colour along her cheekbones that had not often been there in the spring. Marcus waited for her at the foot of the stair in the black, superfine coat, white cravat, white waistcoat, the Ashford signet heavy upon his right hand. He offered her his arm in the quiet, practised manner of a husband who had got into the habit of it over 3 months, and she took it, and they went in together through the double doors and down the length of the shining table to their places at its head. The neighbouring Oxfordshire gentry were there. 10 couples, the Mallorys from Little Rollright, the Bestwicks of Cornbury, the Miss Prendergasts with their father the General, the young Winford Tates. Miss Fortescue sat upon Reverend Harling's left, very pink, with the unwonted grandeur. Mr. Stokes sat between Lady Mallory and Mrs. Winford Tate. Lady Pembroke sat at the foot of the table opposite her nephew, and surveyed the company with her shrewd, pale grey eyes, as a general surveys a field in which every troop has, at last, arrived at its right place. Reverend Harling rose in his plain black cassock before the soup. He held his silver-rimmed spectacles in one long, thin scholar's hand. He had not been asked for any particular form. He spoke into the warm, candlelit quiet of the great dining-room, in the gentle, faded voice that had been tutoring Rutherfords in Latin for 50 years. Father of all mercies, we thank thee for this bread, this wine, this fire, this roof, and these good friends. We thank thee particularly for the 2 old houses of Rutherford and Ashworth, long at variance, and this night at one table, We ask thy blessing upon the Duke and Duchess of Ashford, upon the child who is to come, and upon the memory of those, Henry Ashworth and Charles Rutherford, who did not live to see this evening. Forgive us our old quarrels, and make us fit to be forgiven them, and send us to our meat with thankful hearts. Amen. No one at the long table looked at any person in particular while he spoke. The beeswax candles burned steady in the silver sticks. Mrs. Fortescue had bowed her silver head. Lady Pembroke sat very still, with her hands folded upon the damask. Charles Rutherford, in his garter robes, looked down from above the sideboard and held his painted silence. Across the length of the shining table, Evangeline lifted her clear violet-blue eyes once, for one long, steady second, and met her husband's steel-grey gaze. And then she lowered her look to her plate. Beneath the table, Marcus found her hand, where it lay folded upon her lap, and held it for the length of 3 quiet breaths, and released her. Amen, said Lady Pembroke clearly, and the company answered, and the first soup was carried in by the 6 footmen in the Ashford livery, and the Michaelmas dinner began. It went forward as such dinners go forward in great country houses. Mrs. Fortescue, drawn out gently by Reverend Harling, bloomed with a soft rosy colour she had not worn in 20 years. Lady Pembroke conducted Sir Edmund Mallory through her views upon Lord Liverpool's administration with a precision that made the General laugh once aloud. Mr. Stokes confided to Mrs. Bestwick that the law was a slower trade than people supposed. Mr. Calder, invited up to take his Michaelmas place at the lower end of the table, confided in his soft Cotswold burr that Her Grace had a very nice hand for a ledger, and would be, God willing, the making of the lower meadows. The candles burned down. The September light went out of the west windows into blue, then into velvet dark. The ladies withdrew at 10. The last carriage rolled away at midnight. When the hall had been shut and the great doors barred, and Mrs. Gibbons had carried the last of the silver through the baize door to the strong room, Marcus and Evangeline went into the library together and sat down by the fire. A late letter from Mrs. Fortescue had come by the evening post, kind, affectionate, gently teasing upon a small paragraph she had had into the Bath Chronicle concerning her friend, the new Duchess of Ashford. And Marcus read it aloud by the fire in his deep, clear voice. Evangeline was mending, one-handed upon a small square of plain white lawn. The first 3 inches of hem of a christening cloth, the needle going evenly in and out of the linen by the firelight. He finished Mrs. Fortescue's letter. He folded it. He looked up from it into the soft fire. Lady Evangeline Ashworth Rutherford, he said very quietly. Duchess of Ashford. My dear wife, I began this spring with the intention of spiting my brother. I end it with the certainty that the best action of my life was a cold plan badly reasoned. I am in your debt for the life I did not deserve, and was given all the same one Easter afternoon in Bath. She did not lift her eyes at once from the linen in her lap. When she did, it was to look at him directly across the short, quiet space between their 2 chairs. Marcus, she said, I shall not answer that this evening. I shall answer it every morning for a great many years. He set Mrs. Fortescue's letter aside upon the small table at his elbow. She set her mending down upon her knee. They sat a long time in the firelight without speaking, and the small clock upon the library mantel struck 1 and struck 2, and the fire burned lower in the grate, and still they sat. There are love stories that begin in a ballroom and end at an altar. There are love stories that begin with a kiss. And there are love stories, rarer, slower, earned by daylight inches over 6 months, that begin with a cold sentence on Easter Saturday in a Bath lodging. I do not offer love, madam, because I am not a man who speaks of love, and end in an Oxfordshire library on a late September evening with a man of 32, setting down a letter and saying to his wife in the low voice of a man who has finally run out of defences, "The best action of my life was a cold plan, badly reasoned." The Duchess of Ashford mended her linen, and she smiled, and she said nothing for a long moment. And then she said, "Marcus, I shall answer you every morning, for a great many years." And the fire in the library burned low, and the September wind came in off the Oxfordshire downs, and the old houses of Rutherford and Ashworth lay quiet at last under the same roof, and the long war was ended, and the marriage begun. And so, at Ashford Park in the honey-coloured stone under the late September stars, a marriage made in spite of one brother became at last, and for good, a marriage made in love of one husband and one wife.